What if a simple act sitting down for breakfast could expose a broken system, ignite a national conversation, and remind a city what dignity truly looks like? This is the extraordinary story of Maria Santos, a black female veteran who walked into a humble soup kitchen seeking nothing more than a warm meal, and walked out as the voice of thousands. She didn't yell, she didn't fight, she just stayed seated and changed everything. This isn't just a story about injustice, it's about presence, about quiet power, about what happens when the world finally sees someone it tried to forget. Stick with us to the end because Maria's story will move challenge you, and remind you that sometimes the strongest protest is refusing to stand up. It was barely dawn when Maria Santos stepped through the heavy glass doors of Heart and Home Kitchen, her breath misting in the chill Seattle air as the neon sign above flickered like a heartbeat in the pre-dawn gloom. And in that moment, she felt both invisible and impossibly exposed. A former wildfire firefighter, now reduced to lining up for donated coffee and toast in a community kitchen that smelled of yesterday's grease and this morning's hope. She tightened the worn straps of her faded Nomex jacket, its once bright yellow, now dulled to a ghost of its former self, over the simple gray sweater beneath every fray and stain in the fabric, a testament to a life spent racing toward flames that devoured whole forests and threatened towns. A life where courage was defined by running in when others ran out. And yet here she was, trembling not from fear of fire, but from the cold seam of uncertainty that ran through her bones, as she wondered if she belonged among the huddle of volunteers and early patrons who drifted in through the open door, their voices hushed in reverent respect for the tiny stove where Emily, her friend and tireless volunteer cook, stirred a pot of oatmeal so thick it clung to the wooden spoon, like memories etched in time. John, the owner, stood behind the counter with his sleeves rolled up, the lines around his eyes deepening as he offered Maria the same warm nod he gave every soul who shuffled in before sunrise, a nod that said, "Welcome, you are safe here." And for that simple gesture, her heart stuttered with gratitude, even as her mind warred with doubt. How long before someone decided that a woman in a firefighting coat without an address to her name wasn't entitled to space, to nourishment, to dignity? She placed her hands on the vinyl seat of her usual stool at the counter, the surface cold against her fingertips, and settled herself as Emily ladled oatmeal into a chipped ceramic bowl and slid it toward her, steam curling in the dim amber light like a fragile promise, while John set out a plate of freshly baked biscuits butter, ready to be slapped on soft interior like comfort in edible form. Around her hushed conversations, wove through the air, an elderly man humming a hymn under his breath, a mother soothing her toddler with whispers, volunteers trading soft jokes about how the griddle wouldn't quit until noon, and Maria let the sound wash over her, grounding her in this place that had become a second chance, a hearth for the overlooked, a sanctuary where breakfast came with no questions asked. Yet beneath the veneer of warmth and acceptance lurked an undercurrent of tension, as if the very walls of the kitchen quivered at the thought of authority intruding on kindness, and Maria, despite years of facing down roaring infernos, could not shake the sensation of being watched, of her past valor overshadowed by her present vulnerability. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, inhaling the scent of cinnamon and oak-smoked ham drifting from the next station, tasting the tang of salt on her tongue from the grits Emily had insisted she try. And in that instant, she remembered the roar of the firestorm at Devil's Butte in 2010. The heat so intense it stripped her skin raw beneath the protective layers of her suit. The screams of trapped campers crying for rescue. Her own pulse hammering as she waded into hell to pull them to safety. Yet here in this quiet room, lit by fluorescent tubes and stained glass sunlight filtering through high windows, the battle lines had shifted from embers to prejudice, from destruction to judgment, and she was no longer certain which would prove more dangerous. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft click of the front door as it swung open again, admitting a gust of wind and two figures whose dark uniforms and polished badges seemed to cleave the air itself. Officer Keller's tall frame filling the doorway, first broad shoulders squared like an immovable barrier, and Officer Pierce close behind his clipboard, clutched against his chest as though it were both shield and weapon, their steps measured and deliberate as they scanned the room, eyes settling on Maria with an intensity born of suspicion rather than curiosity. And a hush fell so deep that even the hiss of the coffee brewer seemed intrusive. Emily straightened, worry flickering in her eyes, as she exchanged a glance with John, whose posture stiffened, and Maria felt the familiar churn of adrenaline she hadn't felt since her last rescue mission, a mission that promised life or death. But this threatened to strip her of her humanity with a single curt question, a single demand for proof of worth. They approached the counter, badges gleaming under the harsh light, and Officer Keller's voice, flat and unyielding, asked the question that had haunted her all morning. "Ma'am, are you authorized to be here?" And with the bowl of oatmeal between her hands and the memory of heat and smoke still singing in her veins, Maria lifted her gaze, squared her shoulders beneath the ragged collar of her jacket, and prepared to answer. Maria's heart pounded in her chest like a kettle about to whistle, yet she forced her expression into calm determination as she met Officer Keller's steely gaze, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "I'm here as a member of this community, just like anyone else in line for breakfast." His partner, Officer Pierce, leaned forward, clipboard tapping against his forearm, and asked with thinly veiled derision, "Can you provide any identification or proof of residency?" In one fluid motion, Maria placed her bowl of oatmeal aside, reached into the inner pocket of her Nomex jacket, and withdrew a dog-eared laminated card, bearing the seal of the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, certifying her status as a retired firefighter, having served with honors. Keller's knuckles whitened around his badge as he snatched the card and examined it beneath the flickering lights, his lips curling into what might have been a smirk until he noticed the thin scars lining her wrist, souvenirs from rope burns during a rescue. He stammered for a moment, then pocketed the card without a word. A hush fell over the volunteers and patrons, the air pregnant with tension, as Emily stepped forward, her voice quavering but resolute. "She's been volunteering here every week for months. We don't turn anyone away." Pierce cleared his throat, his square jaw clenched, and retorted curtly, "This is a charity kitchen, not a shelter. We have reports of loiterers impeding business." Maria felt the familiar sting of injustice rise in her throat, but she refused to crumble. Instead, she inhaled slowly, recalling the blaze that threatened the southern ridge, how she'd climbed barefoot across smoldering embers to ensure no firefighter was left behind, and spoke with quiet authority. "I came here because I respect the work you all do, the way you give without asking, just as I did when I answered calls to the wildfire line. I paid with more than money. I sacrificed night's strength, sometimes my very safety, so to be treated like a nuisance wounds me deeper than any flames ever could." Her words, soft yet unyielding, reverberated through the room until even the buzz of fluorescent lighting seemed to falter in their wake. Officer Keller's jaw tightened. "We're just ensuring this place is safe and lawful." Maria's eyes flashed with righteous indignation as she folded her arms over her chest, her posture radiating both vulnerability and unbreakable resolve, and she replied, "If you truly cared about safety, you'd show it by upholding the dignity of those who served this land, those who did what you do now, only for different reasons, so that all of us could wake up this morning in a country we helped protect." A tremor of recognition passed through the assembled crowd. John's grip on the counter relaxed. Emily's shoulders straightened, and even a few strangers nodded in solidarity. Officer Pierce's hand hovered over his radio before he withdrew it and tapped a few buttons, his face betraying confusion. At that moment, Maria knew she had reached a crossroads, either crumble under the weight of prejudice or summon the final measure of her strength. Her fingers grazed the side pocket of her jacket, where beneath her firefighter's card lay a second phone, one connected straight to the regional fire chief and his commission in case of emergencies. With unwavering calm, she slid the sleek device into her palm, pressed the pre-programmed speed dial, and held it to her ear, her back-straight chin lifted, refusing to be cowed. In that instant, the entire kitchen seemed to inhale as one. She spoke two words, words that carried the weight of years spent battling infernos and injustice alike, and in the charged silence that followed, Maria felt the scales of authority begin to tip back toward balance. As the line between duty and prejudice blurred in that humid morning air, Maria lowered the phone without a flicker of triumph in her eyes, only a quiet confirmation that the balance of power had shifted, and the metallic click of Officer Keller's belt as he reached instinctively for his radio snapped the room into uneasy stillness, each volunteer and patron holding their breath as if bracing for an explosion. Yet, instead of the harsh buzz of a dispatcher, the crisp, authoritative voice of Fire Chief Ramirez resonated through the speaker. This is Chief Ramirez. I understand you're questioning retired Captain Santos. I'll be there momentarily to resolve this. At the mere mention of his name, Keller's stance wavered, the broad shoulders hunching, as the weight of his badge suddenly felt too heavy, and Pierce's clipboard slipped from his grasp as though repelled by the truth it sought to obscure. Emily's hand flew to her mouth in shock, while John's eyes glistened with relief, the tension that knotted his jaw unraveling in a single exhale. Maria sat unmoving oatmeal, growing cold before her, like peace deferred her gaze, unwavering as Keller and Pierce exchanged a glance that spoke volumes of regret and resignation. With a stammered apology, Keller straightened and raked a hand through his hair, the veneer of authority cracking to reveal uncertainty before he murmured, "We'll step outside." The clang of the door closing behind them echoed like a gavel, sealing their retreat and releasing the collective exhale of the room. Instantly, applause rippled through the diner, not the boisterous clapping of victory, but the gentle, respectful nods and murmurs of admiration reserved for those who stand undeterred in the face of injustice. Tears shone in Emily's eyes as she poured fresh coffee into Maria's chipped mug, the rich aroma weaving through the air like a blessing reclaimed. John approached, placing a hand on Maria's shoulder, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved lives in the forest. Today you reminded us why kindness matters." Maria nodded, her throat tight with words unspoken, as the rhythmic drip of the coffee machine provided a steady backdrop to the hum of renewed camaraderie. Outside, the roar of sirens grew louder, heralding Chief Ramirez's arrival. But inside, time slowed to the heartbeat of restored dignity, the harsh fluorescent lights softened by the warmth of humanity's triumph. In that suspended moment, Maria realized that no uniform past or present could define her worth. It was her unwavering conviction in the value of every life that had forged her true identity. And as she lifted her steaming bowl of oatmeal in a silent salute to the community that embraced her, she understood that the fiercest fires she would ever face were not those that raged in forests, but the quiet embers of compassion that once ignited could vanquish the darkest prejudices of all. As Chief Ramirez's SUV came to a halt outside the kitchen, its wail subsided into a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the frosted windows as Maria Santos lifted her gaze from the chipped mug cradled in her hands and saw the silver-blue lights reflected on the sidewalk behind the two officers who'd retreated moments before, and she felt a shift in the air as if the very world were tilting back toward justice. With Emily stepping aside to open the door, Maria rose from her stool, every muscle taut with anticipation, and Chief Ramirez strode in with measured authority. His dark uniform crisp, his boots clicking on the worn linoleum like a metronome marking the silence, and without a word, he surveyed the scene, his gaze lingering on Maria's laminated firefighter badge pinned askew to her jacket, then on the vacant spots where Keller and Pierce had stood, and finally on the anxious faces of Emily John, and the scattered volunteers whose hands trembled over coffee pots and service trays. He cleared his throat, the sound resonating like a gavel in a hushed courtroom, and addressed the room. "I apologize for the disruption. Captain Santos. I understand you've faced an unfair challenge to your right to be here." His voice was calm, but carried the weight of accountability, and as he spoke, Emily released a breath she'd been holding since the officers first arrived, and Maria felt the tight coil of unease unwind in her chest. Ramirez continued, "I've reviewed the body cam footage. It does not reflect the values of our department or this community. We're committed to making this right." At the word right, murmurs of approval rippled through the gathered patrons, as if they too recognized that a moral equilibrium was being restored. Meanwhile, outside the front window, a small crowd had gathered, neighbors drawn by curiosity and the faint echo of sirens, and some held smartphones aloft, recording the moment, their faces alight with a mixture of hope and indignation. Maria realized these were not just witnesses, but witnesses with the means to testify, and that thought lent her a profound sense of agency she hadn't felt since stepping into the inferno of her first wildfire. She offered a small nod to Ramirez, who then turned to Emily and John and quietly instructed Emily, "Please make Captain Santos whatever she'd like. John will cover the cost." The words felt like absolution, and as Emily poured fresh coffee into Maria's bowl-shaped mug, the rich aroma curling around her like a benediction, Maria lifted the cup in a silent toast to resilience, to solidarity, and to the simple dignity of sharing a meal without fear. But the drama was far from over, for Ramirez knew that an apology alone would not quell the storm brewing on social media and in the press. He drew a manila folder from his jacket pocket and laid it atop the counter, sliding it toward Maria with deliberate respect. The folder held a letter of apology from the department, formal acknowledgments of wrongdoing by Officers Keller and Pierce, and invitations for Maria to join a panel on community relations. The following week, a platform where her voice forged in fire and tested in prejudice could reshape policy. As Maria's fingers brushed the envelope, she felt the weight of her journey, not just the aches in her knees from carrying hoses up impossible slopes, but the ache of invisibility that had settled in her heart after the sirens of war faded into the echoes of home. With her free hand, she tucked a strand of damp hair behind her ear and spoke in measured tones that carried through the stillness. "Thank you, Chief. I never asked for special treatment. I only asked to be seen." His eyes softened and he replied, "You deserve more than to be seen. You deserve to be heard." At that moment, a ripple of applause swept the room, hesitant at first, then heartened as if each person recognized that this was more than a victory for one woman. It was a reaffirmation of shared humanity. Outside, the crowd cheered as well, their voices rising in a chorus that blended with the distant hum of press vans and the soft beeping of camera shutters. In the days that followed, the story of Maria Santos would blaze across news outlets, her face appearing beside headlines that praised her courage and condemned the prejudice she endured. But here in the warm glow of Heart and Home Kitchen, she savored a quieter triumph, knowing that in rallying behind her, a community had reignited its own compassion, proving that the fiercest flames to battle are those of indifference, and that sometimes the simplest act, insisting on a bowl of oatmeal and a seat at the table, can kindle a movement powerful enough to transform hearts, policies, and the very soul of a nation. Outside, the sky had lightened to a soft pearl gray, casting long shadows from the worn awnings and frost-covered benches around Heart and Home Kitchen. But inside the room was pulsing with something warmer than the heater humming in the corner. It was the quiet thrum of respect, of recognition of a woman once overlooked, now being seen with clarity and care. Maria Santos sat back down in her usual seat, though something about the act felt transformed, like reclaiming sacred ground. Emily placed a steaming plate of eggs and toast in front of her, whispering, "On the house, today. But let's be real, you already paid for it years ago." Maria smiled gently, the lines at the corners of her eyes deepening, not from fatigue this time, but from something closer to peace. Still, she wasn't naive. She knew the road ahead was not paved with applause or trending hashtags. As much as the press had now descended, as much as the city's officials were scrambling to issue statements and redirect blame, she also knew that attention was fickle and dignity had to be defended again and again. What she didn't expect, however, was the phone that began to ring just 20 minutes later, the old prepaid one she'd nearly forgotten she carried. It buzzed on the countertop beside her fork. When she answered, a calm, professional voice introduced herself as Meera Patel, a producer from a national morning show. "Captain Santos." The voice said with crisp reverence, "We would be honored to feature your story, your service, your strength, your perspective on what happened here in Seattle." Maria hesitated. Her story. It had never felt like a story, just survival. But before she could answer, Emily leaned over and whispered, "If you don't tell it, they'll tell it for you." That struck Maria harder than she expected. She didn't want to be turned into a caricature, a headline with a halo. She just wanted the truth, the full, raw, uncomfortable truth, to land where it needed to. So, she said yes, quietly, firmly, then hung up the phone and pushed her plate aside, not because she'd lost her appetite, but because she sensed the moment was shifting. Outside, two teens had gathered near the door, hesitating as if afraid to enter. They weren't homeless by the look of them, clean hoodies, phone cords peeking from their pockets, but they held themselves like they weren't sure they belonged. Maria stood slowly and opened the door for them. "Breakfast is still being served," she said. They looked at each other, nodded, and stepped inside. The ripple effect had already begun. By mid-morning, the story had climbed to the top of Twitter's trending list. "Veteran woman shamed at food, kitchen turns the tables." One tweet read, "Maria Santos didn't just fight wildfires, she's now burning down injustice with grace." The attached clip showed her quiet confrontation with Officers Keller and Pierce, her voice low, her posture proud, her courage unmistakable. Meanwhile, City Hall was scrambling. The mayor, caught off guard by the speed and scope of the outrage, issued a statement, pledging a full investigation into the officers' conduct and announcing a new community task force named at Emily's suggestion, Santos Circle. And that afternoon, as if in response to the wave of support, a non-profit focused on housing veterans pulled up outside the kitchen with 2 staffers and a folder containing the lease for a small furnished apartment 3 blocks away. Maria stared at the envelope as if it were a mirage. "We have a unit available, Captain Santos," the younger of the 2 said gently. "It's yours if you want it. No strings." Maria took the envelope with hands that remembered splinters from climbing ladders and calluses from wielding hoses. "I've slept in shelters, cars, even a supply closet at a rec center," she murmured. "I can't remember the last time I turned a key that was mine." "Then maybe it's time," the woman said, not pushing, just offering. Emily watched from the doorway, her eyes glassy. "You deserve this, Maria. You always have." But Maria didn't answer right away, because part of her still feared the fragility of acceptance of comfort, of things that could be taken away. And yet, as she stood there surrounded by the smells of fresh bread, the chatter of a half-dozen conversations, the buzz of phones lighting up with messages of solidarity, she began to believe that maybe this time things could hold. Maybe the fire she'd walked through had cleared space for something new to grow. That evening, long after the kitchen had closed, Maria walked alone to the address listed on the lease. The building was modest, 3 stories brick, with a green awning faded by rain, but it had a tree out front, a tree with leaves just beginning to bud despite the February cold. She stood there a long while, key in hand, heart thudding, before she finally opened the door. And when she stepped inside, she didn't just step into shelter. She stepped into possibility. The apartment was quiet, almost reverently so. Maria Santos stepped inside like someone entering a cathedral, not because of grandeur, but because of the stillness, the weight of what it represented. She paused just beyond the threshold, key still trembling in her fingers, and let the silence wrap around her like a wool blanket. The room smelled faintly of new paint and lemon cleaner. A small window overlooked the street below, where the first hints of sunset spilled gold onto the sidewalk, casting long shadows across the pavement. She stood motionless for a long time, absorbing the strangeness of solitude that was not laced with uncertainty. No shelter curfew, no timed lights, no bunkmate shifting on a nearby cot. Just her and space and the click of the door as it gently closed behind her. Her eyes scanned the modest furnishings, an olive green sofa, a wooden coffee table with one leg shorter than the others, a kitchenette with a humming mini fridge and a tiny stove that reminded her of the ones used during long fire watch rotations in the California hills. And then she saw it folded on the counter, a neatly pressed navy blue towel with a small white card on top. She walked over, slowly picked up the card, and read, "Welcome home, Captain. You earned this every inch." There was no signature, just those words and the truth they carried. Maria placed her bag gently on the floor, her only bag filled with the few items she'd clung to. Over the years, her VA card, a worn photo of her old fire crew, a bundle of socks, 2 paperbacks, and the service coin she never showed anyone. She sat on the edge of the bed mattress, creaking softly under her weight, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to exhale all the way to the bottom of her lungs. No alarms, no patrols, no side-eye glances from strangers who mistook struggle for danger. Just her and this moment. But peace, she'd learned, wasn't the same as stillness. It had to be earned again and again. Her phone buzzed. Not the old prepaid one she'd left that on the kitchen counter of Heart and Home, unsure if she'd ever turn it back on, but the new one that had come tucked in the folder from the housing agency. Its screen lit up with an unfamiliar number and the words, "Congressman Riley's office." She blinked, hesitating, then answered. The voice on the other end was polite, professional, and to the point. "Captain Santos, we'd like to formally invite you to speak at a Veterans Forum next Thursday in Olympia. The congressman would be honored to hear your story firsthand." Maria didn't know what to say. The words "hear your story" clung to her ribs like a second heartbeat. She'd spent so long surviving in silence, she'd almost forgotten how to speak on her own terms. "Let me think about it," she said softly. "Of course," the aide replied. "You have our respect, no matter what you decide." When the call ended, Maria placed the phone face down and stared out the window. In the distance across the rooftops, the sun finally dipped behind the buildings. The horizon flared into soft purple and burnt orange, the kind of sky you only noticed when you weren't rushing to survive. And that's when the tears came, not the kind that crash out of grief or rage, but the slow, stunned kind that slip down the cheeks when something long hoped for finally arrives. Not applause, not redemption. Just a room, a door, a quiet bed. Later that night, long after the lights of downtown flickered on like scattered stars, Maria lay in that bed staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. She thought of the fire lines she'd crossed, the towns she'd helped save. She thought of the heat and the smoke and the long nights after her discharge where she felt like a ghost wandering a country that praised her sacrifice but ignored her scars. And now, suddenly people were listening. Not just to her story, but to what it revealed about a system that claimed to honor service but failed to see the people behind the medals. Down the street, Heart and Home Kitchen was preparing for another morning, and Maria knew she'd be there, not in line, not this time, but behind the counter. She'd already texted Emily, "Save me an apron." I'm not done helping yet, because home, she realized, isn't just where you sleep, it's where you're needed. And Maria Santos, once a captain in flame, now a quiet force in the heart of a city, had finally found her place to burn bright again. Morning broke, with a softness Maria hadn't felt in years. The kind of morning where light didn't crash in through a shelter's industrial windows or filter dimly through a foggy car windshield, but one that gently wrapped itself around the corners of a room that belonged to her. The sound that roused her wasn't the shuffle of cots being packed away or security guards making rounds. It was the low coo of pigeons on the fire escape and the distant hiss of buses starting their routes. She lay still for a moment, absorbing it all, the warmth of the blanket pulled over her shoulders, the faint citrus scent of the towel she'd used the night before, the quiet tick of the second-hand clock on the kitchenette wall. No alarms, no urgency, just time and choice. But Maria Santos was not one to linger. She rose with purpose, stretched the tightness from her back. Some of it old pain from fireline falls, some just years of carrying too much weight alone, and moved to the closet where a single navy blue apron now hung freshly laundered, bearing the logo of Heart and Home Kitchen. Emily had left it for her after closing last night, along with a note that simply read, "This place is better when you're in it." Maria traced the stitching with her thumb, then slipped it on like armor, like memory, like purpose. She didn't need a uniform to serve, but it felt good to be needed again. By the time she stepped through the back door of the kitchen, the scent of baking bread had already filled the tiled hallway. Emily turned from the stove, ponytail swaying as she grinned wide. "You're early." "I'm always early," Maria replied, and for the first time in a long while, her voice carried not edge, not defense, just lightness. "Well then," Emily said, tossing her a set of tongs. "Let's feed some folks." The morning passed quickly in a blur of hands and kindness. Maria fell into rhythm beside the other volunteers, flipping pancakes, plating eggs, ladling oatmeal, with the kind of quiet precision she used to apply to fireline maps. Her presence changed the energy in the room. People approached her not with pity, but with reverence, as though they were still reckoning with the quiet courage of what she'd endured, and the way she had never once raised her voice or demanded the spotlight. The chairs filled with regulars, some housed, some not. Some knew her story, others didn't. But every one of them noticed when Maria met their gaze and offered them their plate like it was sacred. Around mid-morning, the door opened and in walked a girl, no older than 16. Hoodie pulled over her head, backpack slung awkwardly over one shoulder. Her eyes were wide and unsure, her lips pressed into a line like she was waiting for someone to ask her to leave. Maria spotted her from across the room and excused herself from the line, wiping her hands before walking over. "Hungry?" she asked. The girl hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. Maria reached behind the counter, grabbed a tray with toast, scrambled eggs and fruit, and slid it across. "Sit wherever you like." The girl looked up, and for a second Maria saw herself, not the age, not the life, but the expression, the wary readiness to be rejected. It hit her like smoke in the throat. She smiled instead gently. "You're welcome here. No questions asked." The girl blinked once, then found a seat near the window, hands shaking as she picked up a fork. Behind the counter, Emily watched the whole exchange, then leaned in. "That was you a year ago." Maria didn't answer. She didn't need to. But by noon, things shifted again. A television crew from the local news station arrived, cameras respectfully tucked low, not aiming for drama, but for truth. The reporter, A man in his 50s with kind eyes and sleeves rolled to his elbows, approached with his mic in hand. "Captain Santos?" he asked softly. Maria wiped her hands on her apron and turned toward him. "Just Maria now," she said. He smiled. "May we talk to you?" "Just for a few minutes, off to the side." She hesitated, then nodded. They filmed in the alley beside the kitchen, the din of pans and breakfast laughter audible behind them. "What do you hope people take away from all this?" the reporter asked. Maria looked down, thumb running along the seam of her apron. "That we all carry something. Some scars just show more on the outside, but that doesn't mean they hurt more. What matters is whether we look at each other and see a burden or a person." The interview aired that evening. Short, simple, but powerful. Within hours, a new wave of attention surged online. But this time, it wasn't focused on outrage. It was focused on change. A Seattle City Council member released a statement proposing legislation to require bias and de-escalation training for all officers dealing with unhoused populations. A national coalition of veterans announced a new grant in Maria's name for women discharged from service without stable housing. And across forums and group chats and community centers, people began asking the question Maria had posed on screen. What do we see when we look at each other? Back in her new apartment that night, Maria sat beside the window with a cup of tea in her hand, watching the city breathe under the weight of its own awakening. She didn't know what would come tomorrow. More headlines, more backlash, maybe even more doubt. But she knew this: she had stepped out of the shadows. And not just for herself. And that was enough, for now. Tiep Tuk, Fan 8. ChatGPT, John Noy. The next morning, Maria awoke not to the weight of the past, but to the pull of what lay ahead. Her apartment, still sparse and unfamiliar, had begun to feel less like a borrowed space, and more like something claimed quiet proof that she existed beyond survival. The tea mug from the night before sat on the windowsill, still holding a faint warmth, as if refusing to let go of yesterday's resolve. She got up, tugged the blinds open, and watched the city pulse awake, buses grumbling down 3rd Avenue, joggers dodging puddles left by overnight rain, a woman below arguing with a parking meter as if it had wronged her personally. Seattle alive and absurd as ever. But today wasn't about pancakes or interviews. Today Maria was due at City Hall. The invitation had arrived the night before, via email, a formal request to attend a closed session with the Mayor Chief of Police and a panel of community leaders. They wanted her insight. They wanted to hear her voice. But Maria wasn't naive. They also wanted her name attached to their pivot. The headlines had cornered them, and now, like any institution under fire, they were scrambling for redemption through proximity. Still she went. Because proximity, she'd learned, could be powerful when you refused to stay silent inside it. She wore the same black cargo pants she always had, the same weatherproof boots. But her shirt was new, a gift from a young firefighter who'd shown up at the diner the day after the story broke and simply said, "You're the reason I joined." The shirt was firehouse red with the number 28 stitched in gold thread over the heart. Emily had offered to walk her to City Hall, but Maria declined. She wanted the solitude. The walk. Each block felt like a reckoning, a retracing of steps once taken in fear or fatigue, now repurposed into strength. She passed construction workers who nodded, baristas who smiled wide, and one middle-aged man in a suit who whispered a soft, "Thank you," before hurrying off with his phone pressed to his ear. City Hall loomed ahead, glass gleaming with the smugness of bureaucracy, but Maria stepped inside without pause. A receptionist guided her upstairs, where the others were waiting. And for a brief moment, as the elevator doors closed, she caught her reflection in the mirrored panel upright, composed, undeniably present. When the doors slid open, the room was already filled. The mayor, graying, polished, eager to please, rose from his seat with a hand outstretched. "Captain Santos, Maria," she corrected gently. "I'm not here in uniform." Chief Langford stood next, eyes weary, posture guarded. He didn't smile, he didn't pretend, but he nodded with something that resembled respect. There were 6 people in the room, each introduced by titles that sounded vaguely sincere: Director of Equity Initiatives, Public Safety Liaison, Community Restoration, Oversight Chair. Maria listened. They talked. They spoke of retraining, of rewriting protocols, of engagement pathways and restorative practices. And then the mayor asked, "What would you like to see happen next?" It was the only question that mattered. Maria leaned forward, hands flat on the table. "You want to fix this," she began, "then stop acting like this was about a bad day, or a pair of officers. It's not. It's about a culture that treats certain uniforms like armor and others like targets. No one spoke. She continued. You've got officers trained to see struggle as threat, to see homelessness as criminal. You give them weapons before you give them empathy. You call them heroes when they serve overseas, then let them rot on the sidewalk when they come home. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Each word landed with precision. Start with the basics, she said. Teach them to look. Teach them to listen. Make community service part of their job, not just patrols, but kitchens, clinics, shelters. Let them stand behind the counter and serve the people they've been trained to police. The mayor cleared his throat. That's an interesting model. It's not a model, Maria replied. It's a mirror, and your departments need to look into it. By the end of the meeting, they had asked her to return, to consult, to advise. She didn't agree. Not yet. But as she walked out of City Hall, the cameras were already waiting, dozens now lined up along the steps. Flash bulbs, microphones, a sea of questions. She froze, heart thudding, but then she saw him. A boy, maybe 12, holding a hand-drawn sign in marker ink. Thank you for sitting down, when it mattered. She smiled, not for the cameras, for him. Then she raised a hand, not in salute, not in triumph, but in something quieter acknowledgement. That she saw him too. That night, Maria didn't return home right away. Instead, she found herself walking the long way back through the quieter streets of Pioneer Square, where the old brick buildings leaned into the fog and the streetlights hummed like distant lullabies. Her boots struck the sidewalk with purpose, but her mind wandered, sifting through the moments that had stitched themselves into the fabric of her day. The heavy silences in City Hall, the way the young boy's sign had made her throat tighten, the cameras flashing like lightning without thunder, and the sharp truth of her own words echoing back at her long after the doors had closed behind her. She turned the corner onto a narrow side street and saw at the familiar awning of Heart and Home Kitchen dark. Now the front windows covered with makeshift posters. They hadn't been there that morning. She stepped closer. The glass was layered with handwritten notes taped from the inside, some curling at the edges from the night's damp. Thank you, Maria. Your story is our story. You gave us a voice. There were drawings from children, crayon sketches of fire trucks, of a woman in a red jacket serving soup. Someone had taped a photo of her from a news segment, circled her name in marker, and written underneath. She didn't raise her voice. She raised a mirror. Maria stood there unmoving. For the first time, she didn't feel like a ghost walking among the living. She felt rooted, real. Just then, the back door creaked open, and Emily leaned out, bundled in a coat, holding a steaming paper cup. I figured I'd find you here, she said softly. I saved the last cup of ginger tea. Come sit for a minute. Maria followed her inside. The kitchen was dim, light's low scent of lemon cleaner and bread still clinging to the walls like memory. They sat at the back booth, where sunlight usually spilled in through the eastern window. Now, the night cloaked everything in gentle stillness. I watched the press conference, Emily said. You were steady, clear, not just brave-wise. Maria shook her head slowly. I didn't feel wise. I felt like I was holding something heavy and just hoping not to drop it. You didn't drop it, Emily replied. You passed it to people who've been waiting a long time to carry it with you. They sat in silence for a moment, both sipping tea, listening to the soft clang of the cooling metal pans. Then Maria said, There's something strange about all of this. I used to walk around this city like I was invisible, and now I'm everywhere. My name, my face, my story. It doesn't feel like mine anymore. It feels like it belongs to everyone who's ever sat on a sidewalk and been told to move. Emily nodded. Maybe that's the point. You gave people a way to be seen. Maria set her cup down. And what if I didn't want to be seen? Too late, Emily smiled gently. You already changed things. The next day confirmed it. By morning, word had spread that the Seattle Police Department had quietly placed Officer Keller on indefinite leave. Internal Affairs had opened not one, but 3 investigations into past complaints tied to his badge cases, buried for years now being pulled into daylight like weeds. Officer Pierce had issued a public apology, not through lawyers, but through a handwritten letter he'd posted online. In it, he wrote, I didn't see her that day. I saw a stereotype. That's on me, and I'm sorry. Not just to her, but to everyone I've treated that way. The internet devoured it. Some forgave him, some didn't. Maria didn't comment. She didn't repost. She simply kept showing up every morning at Heart and Home, tying on her apron, wiping down counters, handing out trays. The line of people grew longer by the day. Not just the unhoused, but teachers, postal workers, retired nurses, bus drivers, college students. They came not for charity, but for connection. One man in a tailored suit showed up at lunch and asked if he could volunteer. "I used to walk past this place without a second glance," he said, eyes wet. "Now, I can't stop thinking about how wrong that was." Maria handed him a pair of gloves and pointed him to the dish sink. By the end of the week, Heart and Home had received over 400 new donations. Local newspapers began calling it the Santos effect. Schools requested her to speak. One university offered her an honorary doctorate in public service. She turned it down kindly. "I don't need a title," she told them. "I've got a name." But it was a letter that arrived that Friday afternoon that brought her to stillness. It came in a plain white envelope, no return address. Inside was a folded piece of notebook paper in jagged handwriting. "My brother served with you in Tahoe Uru 9. You saved his life. He told us about you before he died last winter. Said if we ever found you, we should say thank you. So, thank you. You didn't just save him. You gave us a few more Christmases, a few more birthdays. That matters." There was no signature. Maria read the note 3 times before folding it neatly and slipping it into the pocket of her jacket. Her old Nomex one, the sleeves still frayed. That night, as she stood outside the diner, beneath the glow of the porch light, Seattle's skyline rising in the distance like a constellation of windows and promises, Maria understood something she hadn't before. It wasn't about going viral. It wasn't about justice served in full. It wasn't even about redemption. It was about presence. It was about staying. And she wasn't going anywhere. The following Sunday dawned cold and silver, with clouds moving low over Seattle like a slow tide. Inside Heart and Home kitchen, the morning routine hummed quietly. The griddle hissed, the coffee brewed in steady spurts. Emily stacked clean plates beside the warming trays, while volunteers murmured greetings and prepared for another full house. But today the air felt different, charged, expectant, as if the walls themselves knew something meaningful was about to unfold. At precisely 8:00 a.m., Maria Santos stepped through the front entrance, not the back, not the alley where she'd slipped in, unnoticed months ago, but the front the one guests used. She wore her Nomex jacket frayed and faded, but clean, and beneath it a simple navy shirt tucked in with quiet care. Her boots were polished, her face calm. She didn't walk in as a guest, or even as a volunteer. She walked in as someone who had something to say. Emily looked up first. Her brow lifted slightly in surprise, then softened into a knowing smile. She stepped aside. John, who rarely left the kitchen line on Sundays, wiped his hands and joined the servers near the front counter. Even the early diners paused mid-bite, sensing the shift. Maria cleared her throat gently, and the room fell silent without being asked. "I know this place isn't a church," she began, her voice low. But I hope you'll forgive me if I treat it like sacred ground for a minute." The silence deepened not from discomfort, but reverence. "I've sat in this room as a guest, as someone who came in, tired, hungry, and visible, and you saw me. You gave me eggs and toast, and a place to sit where I didn't have to explain myself to anyone, and that saved more than just my body." She paused, her fingers resting lightly on the back of the nearest chair. "When the story went viral, people started using big words, hero icon symbol, but I didn't do anything loud. I didn't march, I didn't shout, I just didn't leave." She looked around slowly. Faces turned toward her, some familiar, some brand new. A young woman with a toddler on her lap wiped a tear from her cheek. An older man near the window bowed his head as if in prayer. "I sat in my seat," Maria said, her voice tightening ever so slightly, "and I waited to be treated like I mattered, and when I wasn't, I didn't yell. I called someone who would listen, and because of that one phone call, everything changed, not just for me, but for all of us." Behind her, Emily folded her arms across her chest, eyes wet but unwavering. "I want to say something that matters today," Maria continued, "and I don't mean a headline, I mean truth." She placed her hand over her chest where the patch on her jacket used to be. Being poor isn't a crime, being tired isn't a weakness, and asking to be seen isn't too much. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, soft and strong. "I wore this jacket into fire zones," she said. "I carried people out who couldn't walk. I stood between flames and the homes they threatened, and when I came back here to the country, I protected. I slept on benches. I ate from donation bins, and I was treated like a threat." She drew a slow breath. "But here at this table, I was just Maria, and that gave me the strength to stand up when it mattered. So, To all of you who've ever been told you don't belong, who've ever been looked at like you were less, I'm here to tell you something simple. She straightened. You belong. It was not dramatic. It was not shouted. But it was absolute. A beat passed, and then another. And then the room, without anyone saying a word, began to rise. Not in applause, not in performance, but in solidarity. One by one, people stood from their chairs, some slowly, some with tears in their eyes, some with hands over their hearts. Emily joined them. John stepped from the counter and did too. Even the delivery driver, who had just entered with a bag of onions, paused at the door, unsure why people were standing, but instinctively joining them. Maria didn't cry. She simply nodded once, the kind of nod you give when you recognize a moment that will live forever in the bones of a place. She sat back down at her old table, her seat, the one near the window where the morning light always spilled just right, and no one spoke. No one needed to, because sometimes the loudest truths are spoken by simply refusing to leave. And Maria Santos, captain, veteran survivor, witness, wasn't leaving. Not now. Not ever. Maria Santos didn't ask for fame. She didn't demand attention. All she wanted was a seat at the table and the respect she had earned long before the cameras ever showed up. But in holding her ground with quiet dignity, she sparked a movement. She reminded us that justice doesn't always roar. It often arrives in silence and stillness, in the unshakable presence of someone who refuses to disappear. If Maria's story moved, you don't let it end here. Share this video. Start a conversation. And the next time you see someone who's been overlooked, don't look away. Because respect shouldn't have to be earned through fire, it should be given through humanity. Leave a comment. Tell us, what does dignity mean to you? And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful true stories from Flow Story.